The headlines on RT International. The escalation in Syria's war sparks U.S. Russian diplomatic clashes at a UN Security Council special meeting. President Hollande arrives in the French port town of Calais after publicly pledging to get rid of Europe's biggest migrant slum as soon as possible. And the first presidential debate between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton expected to generate record audiences, while third-party candidates are still fighting for their right to even be heard. Your Monday Worldwide News Headlines, live from Moscow. From all of us here, welcome to the program on RT International. Accusations flew between the U.S. and Russian envoys at an emergency session of the UN Security Council convened over the escalating bloodshed in Syria. While American Ambassador Samantha Power slammed Moscow for failing to stop the militant violence, her Russian counterpart Vitaly Churkin promised that, well, peace is impossible when terrorists are getting a steady weapons supply from Western backers.
The Russian Federation and the Assad regime have launched an all-out air and ground offensive against eastern Aleppo and its 275,000 civilians.
The main force in eastern Aleppo is Jabhat al-Nusra. They have around 2,000 fighters. The U.S. has essentially acknowledged its inability to influence the armed groups it backs and to honestly comply with the ceasefire terms. Firstly, they did not separate moderate groups from terrorists and mark them out respectively on the ground. This gives the impression that the main goal is to preserve the fighting potential of the Syrian government's enemies.
Russia, of course, has long had the power to stop this suffering. We know that there can be no peace in Syria if Russia is determined to keep fighting this war.
The truce can only be salvaged now through collective action. It is not for us to prove something to somebody unilaterally. We have to see evidence of a genuine desire to separate U.S. allied rebel groups from al-Nusra, then to destroy al-Nusra and bring the opposition into the political process. Otherwise, our suspicions that this was only meant to shield al-Nusra will only grow stronger.
And the UN envoy for Syria, Staffan de Mistura, said that both sides of the conflict are to blame for the escalation in violence. Details now with RT's Emily Sue.
At the UN Security Council emergency meeting, which was convened to discuss the dire situation in Syria, UN Special Envoy to Syria, Staffan de Mistura, made it clear that the escalating violence there, particularly in Aleppo, is being caused not by one, but both sides of the conflict. That is, by the Syrian government's forces and by the opposition.
We have also seen reports of armed opposition groups firing Hellfire rockets. You know what they are? They are basically gas canisters full of clothes and of stones and iron, which are thrown in a rather rudimentary way across the other side of the line and do kill civilians.
The Western mainstream media's coverage of the Syrian crisis, however, tends to focus only on the alleged consequences of Syrian government airstrikes, and very rarely do reports mention what the opposition does. Here's a sample.
Fury of Syria's military.
They seem to be employing bombs which totally destroy some of these buildings.
The Syrian government's all-out military offensive.
Syrian regime forces once again began bombing Aleppo.
At one point, de Mistura also listed some estimated figures of fatalities and injuries in Aleppo, but he admitted none of them can be independently verified. And this difficulty in obtaining accurate information from the ground doesn't just apply to figures, but also to the videos and materials released in support of the various claims as to what's happening there. Speaking more generally, the UN Special Envoy stressed that ceasefire negotiations must continue.
My appeal to this Council today is the following. Please, develop a common course of action to enforce a cessation of hostilities in Syria. I am still convinced that we can turn the course of events.
While America, Russia, and the UN are trying to revive the cessation of hostilities, at the same time, the opposition has made clear its view that it's meaningless to return to truce negotiations. Here's a joint statement released by the many armed groups that make up the Free Syrian Army. On top of that, the chief coordinator of the opposition not only described a strategy for a partial truce as useless, but also urged the U.S. to come up with a Plan B, even though nobody knows what that so-called Plan B actually is. With the opposition refusing to join any peace negotiations, it is unclear when or how any cessation of hostilities can ever be imposed in Syria.
As Emily mentioned, the details of the so-called Plan B are either not clear or not even known. We spoke to various political analysts.
The United States and its allies, they are trying to divide Syria into two parts. One part to the east of Euphrates River, and that part should be under the control of ISIS in the south, and to the north, Hasaka, Qamishli, etc., it should be under the control of Kurdish groups. I think this is what they mean by Plan B. To achieve this plan, I mean, to divide Syria, they must make a non-fly zone over some place in Syria. And we heard a few days ago that the Chief of Staff of the United States, General Joe Dunford, when he said it is impossible to do that.
In the United States, there's a dogfight going on between several sectors of the American government: the CIA, the Pentagon, State Department, and the White House. Those are the four most important ones. And within these institutions, you have what you could call the realists, and on one side, and on the other side, you have the neoconservatives, held by what you could call the liberal hawks, you know, the NGO world, like Human Rights Watch and so on, who look for war as soon as they are hungry for war against the government of Syria.
Meanwhile, the UN ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power, took the opportunity to criticize this channel during the Emergency Council meeting at the UNSC.
A one-sided cessation of hostilities cannot hold. You cannot carry out a massive military offensive and say you are for peace. That might work on Russia today, but it doesn't work when the world has reams of evidence proving exactly what Russia is doing.
I think she doesn't like Russia today because they report the news that the so-called mainstream media in the United States, which are essentially stenographers for the White House and the State Department, don't cover. And as far as her accusing the Russians and saying you can't be for peace as long as you support, what, the government that's defending its own territory? How much can you be for peace, human rights, and democracy if you're supporting jihadist terrorists that cut people's heads off?
الله أكبر. يا وليد.